Well, welcome, everybody. This is Financing Philadelphia's Future. I'm Susan Windle. I'm the facilitator of the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition, and I am here pinch hitting for our usual host, Vanessa Lowe. So today is a continuation in our series of question and answers with our council champion, Derek Green. Let me just say, in preparation for that, make sure that your speaker is in your screen is in, thank you, speaker view. If you haven't been with us before, please let us know your email address if you'd like to be connected to us, and put your, as we listen to Derek, put your questions in the chat. That's it. Here we go. So Council Member Green.
Welcome.
Again.
Susan, I'm going to need to give you a MC voice or name like I did for Vanessa. I got to think of what that may be. Right. Should I say Susan, the poetress Windle?
No, poetress, no. We'll work on that offline.
We'll work on it. Okay. Yes.
Anyway, it's always good to be in conversation with you, as we have been many months since we've been in this campaign, and it's good to have you here. So what we're looking for is an update on the current status of our bill. Council's back in session. We had a little hiatus there. What's up? What's going on?
So the current situation in reference to legislation, we had met with the Philadelphia Department of Banking and Securities previously. We provided a copy of the bill that we had submitted with some suggested amendments. And in response to that, they reached out regarding some concerns that they had based on their interpretation of the legislation. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to resolve some of these issues. Since we received that information from the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities, we met with many of you to come up with some additional amendments, which we think resolves their concerns. We've also reached out to Holland & Knight, who have worked with us in the past. Their contract has concluded. So we actually sent them a copy of the proposed amendments that we worked on with the coalition to both Holland & Knight and the City Law Department. I will say that both from my perspective, the City Law Department and Holland & Knight thought our original bill that we introduced was sufficient. However, we are looking to try to resolve this issue with the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities. So we did send the amendment based on some of their concerns to them, looking to hear back from them, but also would like to have a follow-up conversation with Holland & Knight and the Law Department to discuss all of these issues. The contract with Holland & Knight has come to a close, but we are hopeful that they'll be interested in participating, at least initially, on a pro bono basis regarding some of these remaining issues, so we can move forward to amend the bill, get it passed. And then we have not heard the date for when the mayor will provide his budget address. We're assuming that'll be sometime in March, more likely. And then we can shift to start focusing on the financing and the funding of this initial entity.
Okay, well, I expect there are many of us here who are actually in the coalition. And I expect there are some questions from our folks. Peter, you have something to start with?
Yes, Derek, how is the bill being viewed and received by other council members? Is it something that I know it got voted from the Finance Committee with unanimous approval, and we had overwhelming support, 12 sponsors, back when the bill was originally introduced. But as we're getting closer to the finish line, are there any issues that are of concern to members of council, and how are those discussions going?
Well, we just came back in session on Thursday of last week. I have not heard any specific concerns regarding the bill in reference to passage. However, as we get to what we think will be the resolution of this issue with the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities, we will now update members of council regarding that amendment and give them some perspective that we believe this will be the final amendment. The other initiative that we need to take, especially as we're now getting ready for the budget address, is talking with the administration to get their perspective in reference to operating funds for this initiative, as well as capitalization for the authority. I have received, there's been some issues and concerns raised by various entities that I've had conversations with, from the Pennsylvania Bankers Association, as well as the Cross State Credit Union Association, looking to address those issues so that way we can move forward with the legislation and also hopefully not have any concerns with this legislation being preempted at the state level, which was the end result, an unfortunate result of the work that was done many years ago in reference to our anti-predatory lending legislation, which really became a model in a number of jurisdictions around the country. We're hoping not to have that perspective. And so that's why spending time to kind of work through these issues with the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities.
And Derek, you were talking about the administration. Where does the mayor stand about the Bill 210956?
Well, I haven't got a specific perspective from the mayor. I did have a conversation with members of administration back before the bill was voted out of committee. They raised some concerns in reference to legislation. I gave them my perspective. And so my goal is that once we now have the bill up for final passage, after we get a successful amendment, then we'll be able to have a follow-up conversation with administration about their perspective and also the next steps. And we'll be closer to the mayor's budget address. So I think we hopefully will be able to have those conversations in tandem.
There's a question that's coming from Deb Feigart asking how many votes are now a veto-proof majority now that Councilmember Heenan has resigned? Does that change the calculation in any way?
That is a good question, because we've now gone from 17 to 16 members. Traditionally, if the mayor vetoes a bill, we need 12 votes to override a veto. I have not gotten a sense that the administration would veto this bill, even in our conversations with them, both now and in the past. They raised concerns primarily not about the entity itself, but more about the operations and capitalization. That's coming from Rob DeVoe, but we have not had a specific perspective from the mayor by way of his chief of staff, Jim Engler, or others regarding the concern regarding this initiative. Is more about financing and how it would work from an operational perspective.
You mentioned Finance Manager DeVoe at the December 13th hearing. He expressed some concerns relative to PIDC and PAID. Has there been further conversations and have his concerns been resolved?
Well, I've had a lot of conversations with PIDC for some time, even after the hearing. I've had at least 2 different conversations with them regarding this initiative. We've also had conversations with representatives from the Pennsylvania Community Development Financial Institutions Network, and we have an upcoming call with them. I've also had conversation with other groups from the African American Chamber. I have an upcoming call with the Hispanic Chamber. So we're trying to allay the fears that people have raised. And the consistent fear I've been hearing is that this entity is going to take resources away from community development financial institutions, and that this is going to be in competition with them. And what I've tried to articulate is that those entities do lending, just like you have Wells Fargo, Santander, Univest, TrueMark, the credit unions. They all do lending. So it's interesting how those various entities can be in this ecosystem, but this initiative and this entity somehow is a threat. And I think that's more coming from some who just don't like the idea of creating a public entity. But also, as I've articulated, that those CDFIs, non-traditional lenders or more traditional lenders, they actually do traditional debt. And that is their business and operations of actually lending money. What we're talking about in this phase is an authority that will provide credit enhancements and letters of credit to hard to lend to entities, which is not what they do. And in some sense, although some of those entities, primarily PIDC, is now saying they can do more in the guarantee space, it really does not make sense for an entity to both provide a loan and a guarantee, because that increases the risk that they would have. And so that's why I think having a separate entity like what we are trying to establish to then create the steps to create an actual public bank helps to reduce the risk, both for those entities like a PIDC and some of the other CDFIs, but also allows them to allocate more dollars specifically to what they truly do from a business model, which is lending.
So do these participants in the current participants in the Philadelphia financial ecosystem, understand that that risk mitigation and other activities by the financial authority will be partnering with them and help to open up new markets as opposed to be in competition? Do they get it?
I have articulated that message over and over and over and over and over again. I keep trying to articulate and have been keep reiterating that message. And that's why I've taken the steps over the past couple of weeks, especially since we've come back into this new year, 2022, of reaching out to those groups to relay that same message, as I've said previously. So sometimes you've got to restate a message more than once, more than twice, more than 3 times in order for it to be truly digested. But I will continue to do that by making that type of statement. And I think that will hopefully get those entities to have less of a fear of this entity as it pertains to what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve, and have them really realize this is an opportunity for partnership to allow them to provide lending to those that traditionally do not get access to credit. And what's so interesting, I was just talking to a contact last week, and this is a minority African-American owned entrepreneur. He's had a 17-year relationship with a traditional financial institution. He has a contract with the city. For whatever reason, the city has misidentified his account, and there's been a hold on his account. And he has been waiting for at least 4 months to be paid on work that he has provided to the city. And so he went to his traditional bank asking for an increase on his line of credit. And the banker said, because of how based on his scoring, the application would not be approved. And that banker actually said that he wanted to withdraw his application because his concern was if someone that had additional lending authority saw the scoring on that application, they were afraid that his current line of credit would be pulled. So this is an example, and I've heard multiple examples that fit this framework. Businesses, especially businesses of color in the city of Philadelphia, who are not able to grow. And this is an entity that actually has a contract and revenues are coming. And I believe Revenue Department just cleared up that issue and they're trying to expedite the payment to him. But he's got to pay for the services rendered by his employees based on that contract. And so he can't access his traditional line because up to a certain point, he needs some additional credit in order to handle the cash flow for his employees and others based on a contract that will be coming in, but he cannot get access to additional credit. So it just reiterates the reason why this type of need is necessary in a city that had 562 homicides last year, and in the African American community in particular, 44% population, but only 6% of that population owns businesses with employees.
Yeah. Among the parties that you've talked to, have there been any actions? Stan Shapiro asks, have the big Wall Street banks been heard from publicly or privately on their position on legislation, or have they remained silent?
I mean, in my conversation with the Pennsylvania Bankers Association, it was their general counsel, executive director, and there were banks on there, on that call. But the majority of those banks were the more traditional, regional and also some smaller banks, but not the larger banks. There may have been one or two what some may consider, and when you say Wall Street banks, that's somewhat a misnomer because of the repeal of Glass-Steagall. So we have those banks that are investment banks who now also do commercial, like a JP Morgan Chase. So I have, outside of that outreach with the Pennsylvania Bankers Association, we have not heard, and I have not seen a lot of op-eds in that space. I do know that in conversations, emails with Leonard Bernstein from Holland Knight, in other jurisdictions where there has been public bank legislation, in particular, there's a bill moving through the New York Senate on public banking, and the New York Banking Association has come out very strongly against that legislation. However, I'm not familiar with the specific details of that bill, so it's hard to compare that to our bill without having that background.
Well, back to Philadelphia, with all of the activity that's going on and a few of these as yet unresolved questions, what is the timetable, do you think, in terms of when to expect that this bill will come to a vote in council?
So I'm hopeful that we can get this resolved in February, just based on the fact that we have an amendment that we're going to have a follow-up conversation, Pennsylvania Department of Banking Securities. I'm talking to the entities that have that others have articulated have an issue with this legislation, primarily community development financial institutions. So we're having a call with them next week. And so if we can get over this issue with the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities, I believe we should be able to then amend the bill and then vote it out of committee. Amend the bill on the floor of council and then pass it in council. And hopefully we can get that done in the latter part of February. And we have not yet heard from the administration their timeline for the mayor's budget address. I know the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce is having their mayoral luncheon on February 25th. Generally, that is prior to the mayor's budget address, but we have not heard a specific date when the mayor will plan to come to council to present his budget.
So
I want to jump in and go back to an interesting question that I saw from Ray Torres. Do you know if the U.S. Treasury's new emergency capital investment program may be a way for some of these hard to lend to companies to get capital?
Thanks, Kyra.
That is a very good question. I need to get some more information because I'm not as familiar with that program. And if that's a program that came out of, well, want to be part of Build Back Better, because unfortunately that has not been passed, but I'm not sure if that's a new initiative from this current Treasury Secretary or something that has been put forth. But I would love to get some more information about that. And if Mr. Torres is able to shoot me an email, and I see Professor Feigert also shaking her head about it. So it sounds like some information. And I think most of you have my contact information, but I just put my email in the chat just in case. so that way we can follow up on that conversation.
But Derek, that really gets to the next step in the process, which is finding the initial capital for the authority. And Stan Shapiro asks, should we be participating in the administration's budget outreach and focus group programs to push for operating funds to be included in the budget for the authority and also for capitalization?
Yeah, I think that's something that those conversations should start to begin to take hold, at least from the coalition perspective, reaching out to just start to put together what that messaging will be. From my perspective, I'm going to be using a number of $2 million from an operations perspective. So that's very similar to what was requested both for the Philadelphia Green Capital Corporation, which is a affiliate of the Philadelphia Energy Authority, as well as the Accelerator Fund, which is an affiliate of the Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation. In reference to the capitalization for this entity, that's one number because we've been spending a lot of time on getting the legislation passed. I'm still trying to identify what is the appropriate capitalization amount for this entity. So remember when the council president created the Neighbor Preservation Initiative, which was a $400 million bond offering, the debt service on an annual basis for that is roughly about $20 million. So if you go from 400 million to 200 million, you're looking at a $10 million annual debt service. If you're going from 100 to, from 200 to 100, then you're looking at another reduction. So now you're talking about a $5 million debt service. So trying to figure out what is the appropriate amounts, and also in having those conversations with Greg Heller, as well as Mary Rose Matitas from the Philadelphia Green Capital Corporation, and Greg Heller, that was formerly with PHDC, helped start the Accelerator Fund. We have an idea of what their operating costs, but also trying to get an idea of how many deals are they doing on a annual basis. And I think will give us some perspective on what's the right capitalization. Because from a budget perspective, if we're saying, let's not say I'm committing to this number, but let's say we're talking like $100 million. So if you're talking about $100 million, you're probably talking about 5 million in debt service, give or take. So that's about $25 million over the course of a 5-year plan in reference to actual debt service. So that gives a perspective of if we're looking at it, if 100 million is a right amount, and we could also do this in various tranches, but let's say we said 100 million is the amount, then you're talking about committing in the budget from a debt service perspective, about $5 million per year in reference to capitalization aspects of this. And if we think that it may need to be done in different tranches, maybe do 3 tranches of 75 million, 100 million. So those are some things we've got to come to a perspective on in reference to the next steps in reference to the bank itself. And I will say that Walt McCree had actually provided some good information from Commonwealth of Massachusetts regarding their public banking model that gave some perspective on capitalization for what they're trying to do in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which I've kind of used somewhat as a reference in reference to looking at these capitalization numbers.
And would the American Rescue Plan be a source for capitalization?
Probably not, because what has happened with the American Rescue Plan, and that's coming to the city through 2 tranches. Last year during the budget process, the administration basically committed almost the entire $1.4 billion for that. Now, that doesn't mean that in this year's budget process, we could identify other general fund dollars for capitalization, but from a budgeting and financing perspective, it's probably easier to say, as opposed to take $100 million out of the general fund, it's probably easier to say, well, we're going to allocate $5 million on an annual basis of debt service in order to help provide money for $100 million through a bond offering that could capitalize the authority.
And one final question with the roughly 6 minutes we have left from Stan. Should we ask the controller to help us put together a proposal to the pension board to place some of its funds with the authority / bank?
So as you know, we did have a conversation with our city controller some time ago about identifying possible dollars. And from my recollection, there was some challenges. We may want to circle back to her, but ultimately that would be something for the pension board to make that decision. And remember, they're doing their investments based on what they think makes the most sense for both current city employees and retirees that will give a return on those dollars invested. So we would have to make that argument, and then they would do their analysis. Could be ultimately up to the pension board to make that decision on whether they felt that an investment in this initiative will provide the type of return that is sufficient to meet the goals that they have. And one of the challenges that we've had at the pension board has been the underfunding of pensions in reference to the pension fund that's not funded. We don't have the current amount of funds also returned to be fully funded as a pension. And although they've made some significant strides in the past couple of years, we're still not at a fully funded level. So I'm just giving some context, not saying they would not support or they would support. I just want to provide some additional perspective on that question.
So Derek, given all these considerations, what do you think is the realistic expectation of when the financial authority will be in business, being an operating entity and lending money or providing credit enhancement?
That's a good question. In talking, I had a conversation with Greg Keller a couple weeks ago, and from my recollection, they were trying to raise, I believe they were trying to raise about $40 million for the accelerated fund. I think they are about halfway there. And they spent about a year in fundraising, and now they're going to start operations. From my perspective, if we issue debt through the city, that will be a faster process, but there still are various professionals, others that will have to be involved in offering. I am going to have a upcoming conversations with our city treasurer, Jackie Dunn, regarding outstanding or upcoming offerings by the city. And in my role as chair of the finance committee, those will come through my committee, but it also provides an opportunity to get a perspective from her that if we got this passed sometime in, let's say, the legislation passed around the time the mayor's budget address, and then also as part of the budget, we're able to pass the operations aspect of it, getting a sense of what would be the timetable for the capitalization side, which could be something by the fall, I would think. Once if this, let's say $2 million is put into the budget, then we're talking about July 1 as the new fiscal year starting, and then having those dollars being allocated from an operation perspective to get the entity up and running. And then in reference to actually offering products, possibly 2023, but that's assuming all these things come into line like we're talking about right now.
Well, Councilmember Green, let me just thank you for your tenacity, your persistence, and also everyone else who's involved in this coalition, because we've been at it a while, haven't we? And it's a long-term project that we hope will benefit generations to come. So
thank you. I think through this process, I went from looking not like Stan to looking more like Stan to looking back like I was before.
And to anyone who is here who is not on our email list and would like to be, please drop your email in the chat. And we're signing off for now. Be back next month. Thank you, one and all.
Bye.